Here we are, folks, another Tuesday evening. Great to see you on the stream. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'll put the pre-show on just for a second. And there was a bit of a comment in the chat about me not being on the mainstream media. Well, I've had a few outings recently, but the time difference makes it a little difficult. I did actually record an interview with ABC Illawarra the other day, which is going to go out over the next day or two. So that was on property and related issues. So still doing some, but probably not so active as when I was in the country, simply because they can't cope with 11 hours time difference at the moment. So we'll see. Anyway, good show this evening. Robbie's teed up, ready to come in. Of course, we have the doggies here as normal. They've been out and about for their walk this morning. It was pretty cold this morning, a lot of frost, but no snow yet. A few people have been saying, show us the snow, show us the snow. Well, I can't, because we haven't had much. We had a very, very minor sprinkling over one night, but that's all. So, but we'll see. And of course, as normal, Robbie's there over there, ready to come in a second or two. I've got the chat running up there. I've got the control systems over here. I've got the multi-view there, and I've got the streaming systems over here. So everything's running, and we should be in for a good conversation tonight, hopefully. A lot to talk about: central banks and related issues, and financial tyranny, and what we can do about it. Always a big conversation. Anyway, I'm going to take the pre-show off. I'm going to run start show, and I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 16th of January 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on tonight, and very important conversation as we come into 2024. Lots to talk about with regard to the financial system, banks, cash, all those good things. And of course, Robbie and the Citizens Party is right in the middle of that fight, along with me and a few others. So should be fun. And as with everything, there's lots of different opinions out there, but we're going to try and run a few conversations. Where did central banks come from in the first place? Who's in control of those central banks? What happens if you give up power to central banks? And of course, the broader questions like, well, cash in society, where's that going? And, are banks actually for us or against us in terms of, ordinary Australians, be they businesses or commercial entities? So those are some of the questions to touch on. There are also some action points. There are some things that we'd very much like people to get involved with over the next few weeks and months. So we'll highlight some of those too. Before I just bring all of that together and bring Robbie in, let me just remind you, we don't provide specific financial legal advice on the channel. We do moderate the chat. Do play nice. Throw your comments and questions in. Always encourage that, but please no racial slurs. As at the 16th of January 24, if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to get your question or my attention, use @WalkTheWorld. That'll go into my queue, and that means that I can then see what's going on. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think these are really, really critical issues, perhaps never more important than now. And with that introduction out of the way, let me bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello. Welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me. And I think this is the first. We've done an interview from this house, but this is the first live stream from the new studio, the new office.
Yes. You're now on the mortgage bandwagon, right?
I'm a mortgage slave, like most of the rest of everybody, and I feel their pain.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you.
But I was a powerless tenant for many years before then. I discovered how powerless I was, and by the time when I started looking I was forced to look for an alternative, and renting in Melbourne was just as expensive as buying. Then I had no choice but to become a mortgage slave.
Yeah, and it is interesting because there are a lot of renters who are actually trying to make the same switch because they can't, they don't feel under control in the rental sector. The rents are running through the roof still. And unfortunately, of course, you'll know if you were searching for alternative rental accommodation, the queues are long, the supply is short, and the lack of control that people feel is actually one reason why they're piling into the mortgage sector. And in fact, the latest data showed that credit was up. The growth of new credit, worryingly, was much stronger for investors than for owner occupiers. So once again, we've got this probably things spinning out of control, and we'll come into that as we get into the conversation, because I think it's really important that we want to stay grounded, right? There are really important things that can be done and should be done to try and actually deal with some of these issues. So rather than just talking theoretically, I'm going to hopefully get quite practical as we go through this conversation.
Yes. So much of what has passed for economic policy has to be evaluated as not worked. And the prevailing orthodoxies, though, unfortunately, are still prevailing, and we're in the middle of fights over that. And we'll talk about the RBA reforms bill in a minute, which is an example of that. And one of the points that we make in terms of solutions, there's different ways to solve problems. Sometimes, I firmly believe, Martin, the solution involves going back and seeing where the problem started and what policies that were in place before that and whether they worked and why we deviated from them. And if they did work and we deviated from them for no good reason, going back to what worked, right? And politicians don't tend to like to do that, but I think in some cases in the economy nowadays, it's crying out for it.
Yeah, and it is worth just reflecting, central banks didn't emerge out of a vacuum, right? And central bankers, there are central banks now in many countries that sit under the Bank for International Settlement. Well, the BIS also didn't come out of a vacuum, right? And there is actually a set of ideologies that underpinned the creation of central banks and central banking. And it's worth just briefly resting there for a minute to think about it, right? Because the system as we've got it today is a deliberately constructed system. It's not a happenstance. It didn't just sort of pop out of nowhere, right? There are a series of philosophical assumptions and doctrinal assumptions and, frankly, political assumptions that have led to where we've got to. And actually, that's quite important when we come to think about what do we do ahead, right? Because obviously, if we can understand what the agenda was and why it was actually created the way it was, and I say created deliberately, this wasn't just happenstance, it didn't just happen. There was a deliberate set of ideology that drove it. So let's just dwell there for a minute, Robbie, because I think it's important people get the context for some of the things we're going to talk about down the track.
Well, Martin, it's funny you should mention that, because we didn't pre-prepare this discussion at all. Here's one I prepared earlier. Our office has just published this report. The author of this report is actually my wife, Elisa Barwick. This is a series of 9 articles that she's written, extensive articles over the last year or so. And the title of the report is what you see, The Genesis of Austerity. And this question of austerity is intimately tied up in the origins of central banks. So you're talking about a 20th century phenomenon that really took off post World War One, but or from World War One onwards. But can I say, I think it's important to provide a bit of context before that. So regular viewers of these interviews will understand that the Citizens Party are massive advocates of a national bank. A national bank is not a central bank. A national bank is the central bank, but is not a central bank. It provides that role in the economy, but a central bank is a different animal. Central banks aren't national banks. And the origins of national banking go back to Alexander Hamilton in the first administration after the US won its War of Independence against the British. And Hamilton created the first Bank of the United States, and then it was followed by a second Bank of the United States. And the whole purpose of national banking was to recognize that banking was this incredible power of being able to create credit, and done properly, create credit against the future capacity of a nation. Understand the nation had capacity and potential, and if the credit created was put into productive means, things that would unlock that potential, then there was no problem with paying it back and those sort of basics of banking. But it was about unlocking that potential, and a national bank was able to make those decisions in a way a private bank wouldn't, because a private bank is necessarily obligated to its shareholders and focuses on more short-term profit. And I made this point when I testified with Glenn Isherwood to the hearing on bank branch closures on the 1st of December in Canberra. We were able to testify there, and I made the point that if we started a national bank now, and we advocate doing it through post offices, you could actually revive regional Australia because the bank would be able to go out in those areas and make loans that private banks are cutting them off from at the moment. They will never do it because they don't want to take the risk. They don't want to take that responsibility. They just want to focus on mortgages in Sydney and Melbourne. But if the public bank did it, it would create economic wealth out there, and you will see a flood of private banks back to the regions to tap into that wealth, to capitalize on that wealth. They could, if they thought long-term enough, unlock that themselves, but they won't, and they never do. And this is what Alexander Hamilton understood. Look, if the government used its own bank, this is the potential. And so he created this bank. That led to this enormous tension in the US political system, because between the people who are pro-development and pro the bank and people who are anti-development and anti the bank. You also had, in terms of the way the politics worked, you had this British influence on the anti-bank side because they didn't like the idea of having a government bank. There already existed the central banks already existed. The Bank of England had started in 1694 in the United Kingdom. It's one of the world's oldest central banks. It already existed as a private central bank. So it had this controlling role in the economy, but it was entirely private under a special charter from the king of the time. And it was private up until Clement Attlee nationalised it in 1936. You had the world's biggest, most powerful central bank was this private central bank. Hamilton had done something different. But let's jump forward more than a century now to World War I, because this is what our report covers. And we'll provide a link in the comments. Look for comments from me, because we can put a link there to this report and people can read it and get a bit of a sense of it. Essentially, this was the biggest, most destructive war in history to that point, World War I, and we know the history of it. That when it ended, you had all these countries that were in enormous debt. Now, of course, who were they in debt to? They were in debt to the people who always benefit from wars, which were the bankers. All wars are bankers' wars. But there were things that had to have been done inside those countries during the war that kind of broke with the orthodoxy. And I know I don't have a lot of detail on this, but I know you probably know a bit more of it than me, Martin. But even in the UK, you had this thing called the Bradbury Pound or something like that, where the British government had been forced to issue its own special currency for the war effort. In Australia, we had done extraordinary things with the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank had played an incredibly important role in funding the war effort in Australia, but everyone ended the war in massive debt. And so then there became this debate about how will that debt be paid back. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany these completely punishing, repressive sanctions, basically war reparations, and that crushed the German economy. And it was the direct crushing of the German economy that led to the hyperinflation Germany suffered. But that hyperinflation created a scare, and that scare was seized on by people, and the real brains trust were people in the Bank of England, people in the halls of power in places like Italy, banker types in originating in Genoa and Venice, and these people, and they wanted to impose this idea that the debt was sacrosanct, and so it didn't matter who suffered in order to ensure that debt was paid back. This was an idea that they wanted people to grasp, and not everyone wanted to accept that idea, especially the people who were being made to suffer to pay back that debt. And the policy was this idea of austerity. If there's any doubt about the soundness of a currency, backed up because the debt of a nation is unpayable, then the people, their living standards must be crushed in order to make sure that debt can be repaid. And there was an enormous backlash to this idea, and it set up this big struggle. And in Australia, the backlash was led by the Australian Labor Party. And you got some of the best insights into this actual fight from great Australian Labor Party figures who are actually looking at the fight in Australia, but also in Europe. And we're talking about people like Frank Anstey, who was the mentor for John Curtin, and the great Jack Lang. And Jack Lang, if some of you may remember, the former Premier of New South Wales, the big fellow they called him, he wrote a lot of this in a book called The Great Bust. But what the Bank of England did was they under the governor, Montague Norman, they devised this idea of having a system of central banks where the actual reins of economic power could be held independently from the elected government. And they created this narrative that elected governments were irresponsible with money. And so you needed to have these unelected expert technocrats control the money supply. This was the Bank of England's idea under Montague Norman, and he dictated the rise of central banks around the world to enforce this policy. And we know the history of it pretty well here in Australia. And the Jack Lang lays out in his book, The Great Bust, how Norman saw that there would be a system of central banks, and then there would be a central bank of central banks. And Lang in the book thought it was Norman's idea was the Bank of England would be that. Well, in fact, what the Bank of England set up was sort of like a cutout for itself, called the Bank for International Settlements. And to this, from its inception in 1930 odd, initially as a way of ensuring settling the German war reparations payments, but expanding quickly beyond that. From its inception, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel has always been dominated by the Bank of England, even much more so than the US Federal Reserve. The Bank of England is the biggest influence from the time of Montague Norman. And there's a whole bunch of things you can read about the Bank for International Settlements. I remember there's a great book called The Tower of Basel by Adam Labor. And if you read that, I remember the time I read it, the one thing that made me fall off my chair, because it seemed inconceivable to me, was that the Bank for International Settlements in Basel in Switzerland has the people who work there have the same diplomatic immunity as the diplomats at the UN in New York and Geneva. Now, there's a reason for diplomatic immunity. Diplomatic immunity is a principle that's centuries old, right? The envoy of a king had to be able to go and talk to another king without fear of getting his head cut off, right? Or else, that was the reason for it. Diplomatic immunity is a sacred idea. These bankers have it. These bankers in Basel have it. Now, it just so happens, Martin, that this week is Davos week. You may have noticed, and there's lots you can talk about with Davos and the World Economic Forum, etc. And there's an enormous amount of attention on it actually nowadays because of the World Economic Forum, because of Klaus Schwab, etc. But I don't care what comes out of Davos, and we have always maintained and still do maintain, and always will maintain, that Davos is not the city in Switzerland that people should be paying the most attention to. It's Basel. That is where real power is wielded. But understand the principle that I alluded to earlier. It's wielded in this way that Montague Norman envisaged, where it's outside of of political accountability. They succeeded in brainwashing generations of people to accept this idea that governments are irresponsible, to accept the narrative that governments are irresponsible. And so the real power must be held by the technocrats. And that's the system that we have today. I'll give you two quotes from the 1930s that sort of capture this. When Jack Lang was the Premier of New South Wales, he actually defaulted on New South Wales debt. He declared a debt moratorium on debts to the UK, and the governor, stepped in and dismissed him over it. But it set off a huge debate, because Lang's argument was this: the Americans had forgiven the British their World War I debt, why should the Australians suffer to pay our World War I debts to the UK? That was his argument. Now, at the time, a young Robert Menzies, and this is a paraphrase, but he said something like this. He was recorded in a public street debate saying something like this. He said, "I would sooner every man, woman, and child in this country die of starvation than for us to fail to honour our contractual debts to Great Britain." That's what Menzies said around 32, 33, something like probably 32 at the time. He had completely bought into this idea that the debt is sacred and all austerity was justified in order to pay that debt. That's one quote. That was early in the decade. Later in the decade, John Curtin, who was the Labor opposition leader at the time, he was taking on this idea that there should be an unelected banking power that's in charge of the economy. And we've quoted this lately in relation to this RBA reform bill, because when in September 1937, he launched the Labor Party's election campaign at the Fremantle Town Hall in Western Australia, and he called for the government to have the final say over monetary policy, which the 1937 Banking Royal Commission had said it should. So he called for that to be implemented. He said, unless the government of the day, if the government of the day absents itself from the making of monetary policy, it cannot govern except in a secondary degree. And what he's meaning there is, if the government isn't having the final say over monetary policy, i.e. interest rates and the money supply, somebody else is in charge, not the elected government. And so this comes down to a question of democratic principle. But, of course, the people who came up with the idea of the central banking system, Montague Norman, the Bank of England crowd, they were unelected anyway, right? They represented an elite unelected power, and that is precisely what they wanted. And sadly, today, through deregulation and privatization and the implementation of central bank independence in the 1990s, etc., and the increasing power of the Bank for International Settlements, we now have every person in charge of our regulators in Australia, like the bank, the Reserve Bank and APRA, come through the Bank for International Settlements. All the Reserve Bank governors spend a stint over there at the Bank for International Settlements. And therefore, Martin, what Jim Chalmers is proposing to do, which is to give up his veto power, which has been in law for 72 years, thanks to Curtin and Chifley, passed in 1945 originally, to give that up, to hand over that power. He's not just giving it to Michelle Bullock because she's a nice person. He's actually handing it over to the BIS system, right? He is absenting the elected government of Australia from any say in this most powerful of tools for our economy, and we will now be dictated to entirely by the Bank for International Settlement system and the Bank of England behind it.
Yeah, and a couple of observations, because that history is really important to understand, right? So if you want to know where this whole idea of neoliberalism comes from, well, it emanates from here, right? Because basically what it says is you need to let the private markets be the private markets. We shouldn't be having a lot of public investment, et cetera, because, of course, public investment is, quote, inefficient or whatever. But it also means that basically you've got a small cabal which basically is calling the shots. And interestingly now, central banks have been writing recently that their monetary policy tools are probably not adequate. So what we should perhaps be doing is, using the central bank digital currency as yet another set of levers that we can implement our policies on. And also, some central bankers are now saying, well, fiscal as well as monetary policy maybe should be also within this bailiwick of these technocrats. So in other words, what they're doing is actually wanting to control more and more of the way the economy works based on a set of ideologies, which is fundamentally, well, who pays? Ultimately, It's individuals who pay. And, there have been a number of speeches made over the last few years that say, well, when things go wrong, who ultimately has to pay? It's individuals. And you've seen this through the inflation cycle. Who are the people who are suffering? It's not the bankers. The banking system was protected. Think of the term funding facility, that very, very cheap money that ultimately they earned 4.35% or 4.25% or whatever it was on it until recently. So the central banks are now protecting the banking system. The central banks have an ideology that says we should actually let the central banks drive that agenda, and we should allow the financial stability to be all driving everything, right? And so we've lost this idea that actually banks and bankers are not an end in their own right, but they're there to facilitate and enable other things to happen. And that's where this has gone so terribly wrong, because what it means is that the agendas that we have is that we have more and more people paying more and more of their income for longer periods of time to support their mortgages because, the mortgages are bigger and the rates are higher. And you've got the debt bomb being effectively loaded bigger and bigger and bigger. And interestingly, now in the US, the Federal Reserve has actually done quantitative easing. Now it's done quantitative tightening. So they inflated their balance sheets by more than 50% and they've dropped it by 13%. But in the meantime, interestingly, in the US, the Treasury has been issuing way more debt than ever before. So there's a bigger debt question in the US. Yes. And in fact, if you look at what some of that funding has gone through, it's the green agenda and those sorts of things. So the point to understand is that the way that the banking system currently is behaving at the moment is fundamentally driven by a set of ideologies where a small number of people get very rich and are calling the shots, and a large number of people are basically, receiving the crumbs off the table if they're lucky, but ultimately are in some sort of tyranny.
Well, no, exactly, and even so, let's just talk about the Bank of England for a bit. From its earliest days, right? It was a private syndicate that bailed out the king at the time, King William, in exchange for this charter that gave them exclusive say over the British debt, and through that the say over the British financial system. Now, did the people running the Bank of England care about the poor people on the street? No, they were the rich elite. They were the aristocracy, and they instinctively know what's in the self-interest of their class, and that is what they served. And British society at that time, Charles Dickens wrote books about it, right? Was this completely elitist class society where if you weren't in those classes, and even now there's the snobbery is still enormous to this day. That's what the system served. And whenever there was any kind of attention put on trying to do something from the poor, the people who tried to do that were always up against this entrenched vested interest. Now, I don't have the quote with me, but William Gladstone, the prime minister in the 1870s, he set up the world's first post office bank precisely so poor people could save money, because banking wasn't a service for poor people in those days, and it was a public bank. It was the biggest branch banking system in the world, and then a decade later, the Japanese copied it and set up what is now Japan Post Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world. But Gladstone wrote in his memoirs, he said how difficult this fight was to set up this post office bank against the power of the City of London. He said, the quote goes something like this. He said, the hinge of the whole situation like this: the government was not to be a significant power of matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned. That's the way he put it, right? Supreme and unquestioned. We are the government, but this money power, they are above us, that they think of themselves as above us and untouchable. So what are we dealing with now in our situation? Because it's never changed. The Labor guys, the greats that I quote, O'Malley, Anstey, Curtin, Chifley, etc., like Jack Lang, these were not perfect individuals, but they lived and breathed a dedication to raising the standard of living of the common man. That's what they were in politics to do. That's what they were dedicated for. And they identified early on that what they were up against was this money power. And this central banking system was always dominated by this elite class that saw government as a nuisance, and they saw themselves as above that and should be untouched by it. Problem is, politics ebbs and flows, and by the end of World War, the combination of Roosevelt in America implementing the New Deal, the fight in Australia that was on at the same time, where they're actually taking on the entrenched power of Wall Street and the bankers in London, etc. The way World War II played out, and then immediately after World War II, there's a term they use, Martin, called it's called the political settlement, or you could say the consensus, or nowadays as a more technical term, the Overton window. At the end of World War II, though, there was an understanding that, hang on, no, the government had to be involved. The government could not absent itself, in the way Curtin put it, could not absent itself from responsibility for the economy, and it needed a bank. That was the actual consensus. That was the political settlement at the end of World War II, such that the Prime Minister of the UK, Clement Attlee, went and nationalised the Bank of England precisely so the British government could have that tool. Now, if you read the histories of that, as an aside, he nationalised the Bank of England, but the British government was never able to bring it under control, because the entrenched elitist structures that have always controlled the Bank of England made sure that they stayed in charge. And in fact, in 1947, what we know as modern neoliberalism was born again in Switzerland. What is it about damn Switzerland? On the slopes of Mont Pelerin in Switzerland, a mountain, Mont Pelerin. They had a conference there, and the conference was attended by people like Milton Friedman in the United States and Friedrich von Hayek, the economist, the great godfather of neoliberalism, and Ludwig von Mises was there. And in fact, Ludwig von Mises called people like Hayek and Milton Friedman, he denounced them as socialists at this conference because he thought they were too soft on the people, even though they were more on his side, pro-austerity, etc. But this conference was sponsored. The money put up for this conference came from the Bank of England. It put up some of the money for this conference. The Bank of England was sponsoring this just as the time, even in the year after it had been nationalised by the British government. And they did not have sway at the time, right? They were not part of the consensus. But what they dedicated themselves to doing was creating this, pushing this body of neoliberal ideas, such that at a certain time they could take over with those ideas. And essentially that opportunity came at the end of the Bretton Woods system when, first Thatcher and Reagan and Bob Hawke and Paul Keating in Australia and Roger Douglas in New Zealand, and these guys, they felt empowered to, and again, with the same backing from the same elite groups, with the very people involved in the original Mont Pelerin conference. You had Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman touring Australia, giving seminars on this kind of stuff. You had the big mining companies in Australia actually sponsored secret meetings in the Labor Party. This is Paul Kelly, the Australian journalist, writes about this in his book, The End of Certainty, right? You can read it in there. He describes a conspiracy, an actual conspiracy, where a faction of the Liberal Party held secret meetings in the early 80s. They kept them secret from Malcolm Fraser because he knew they'd shut them down so they could plot how they would take over the Liberal Party with these ideas. And it led to a fight in the 80s between what they call the wets and the dries. And the ideas were neoliberalism, right? We're going to privatize everything. We're going to smash all the unions. We're going to unleash deregulate the whole financial system and the whole economy, etc. And nothing's going to hold us back. Now, I'm just to quickly get to the point of where we are right now, though. One of the products of that deregulation, and this is, don't take my word for it. Ask Martin North. You've had a longer history in this than me, Martin. But one of the products was this explosion in financial speculation.
Yep.
Now, that was not done by me. I was a kid. That was not done by Joe Average and Mrs. Average, right? That was not done by the people, all the mortgage slaves in Australia. They weren't the ones speculating. They were just trying to work, save money, buy a home, raise a family. They are not responsible. That was done by bankers. It was done by elite rich people. And they increasingly couldn't resist it. Every opportunity for speculation, because suddenly they're making massive profits much more quickly. And they should have been able to think, whoa. I mean, you actually hear the old timers, right? Like Warren Buffett, right? Warren Buffett says, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. I mean, these old timers, like the fact they made those observations, there was a faction of people all along who knew how insane this was. You and I have done these incredibly important shows about the rise of derivative speculation, right, yep. Martin, right?
Yep.
And it was just bananas. The fact that it was legal was bananas. And it all came crashing down in 2008. And what did the same governments do that are actually imposing austerity on us now when it came to the bankers and to these elite people? What did they do to them? Did they impose austerity on them? I remember in 2008, when the protest broke out in New York City on Wall Street about the crisis, right? And I saw this picture and it's seared in my brain, this grizzled older black man. He's holding up a sign and the sign says, pull yourself up by your own fucking bootstraps. Right? You rich bastards, you preach this bullshit to us. Oh, work hard and you'll achieve the American dream, blah, 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 dangling it out there because knowing it'll never happen for 99.99999% of people, but you got to keep them on that treadmill so that you can just be sitting back and raking in this money from all your idle speculation, etc. When it was their turn, the government and the central banks couldn't bail them out quick enough.
Yep.
And how did they do it? They did it by creating they started sowing the seeds of the inflation crisis that really blew up in an obvious way in the currency in the last couple of years, but it was already there in the speculation. We called it, asset price appreciation of housing. Hello, it was inflation. From the year 2000 onwards in Australia, we had an inflation crisis. It's just that we were all brainwashed to think, oh, I'm getting richer. No, it was inflation. It was asset price inflation. And now we've got governments that are so desperate to keep that up, but on the other hand, they're so brainwashed into the central bank thing that they're letting the central banks crush us with these interest rate rises. And Michelle Bullock testified to Parliament last year and she said, we only have one tool. And I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. That is a lie. That's a tool they chose to use to crush the people who didn't cause the problem in order to again save the system. But now because it's actually house prices that could be at risk if this didn't have some kind of countervailing pressure on it, what is the government, the elected government doing, which has absented itself from monetary policy and so having no say over this? What are they doing to try and keep house prices up? They've opened the floodgates for the biggest flood of immigration in Australian history. I think there's 600,000 people coming into an economy that's building like 40,000 houses a year, something like that, right? It's absolutely crazy. But they're succeeded in creating this pressure. And if you're watching this and you're one of the people that are suffering right now under these interest rate rises, the fastest interest rate rises in history, if that's smashed you like it's smashed so many others, and Martin, it shows up in your surveys, what should really piss you off is those press conferences you've seen Jim Chalmers give, where he looks like he's really mad they've raised interest rates, and he expresses so much concern for the households that are suffering under this. He has the power to overrule it and stop it. In fact, the Citizens Party today called for Chalmers to use his power. The very power he's proposing to legislate away, we're calling for him to use his power to lower interest rates by 1% or 2% to give relief, but at the same time stop pretty much all lending to investors in Australia so that the lowering interest rates does not fuel more property speculation. It only provides relief to the people who are already in debt and need housing. That's what the powers were invented for. Instead of removing them, he should be using them to provide that kind of relief for the people who didn't cause the problem, just wanted to get on with their lives, while these elite people who created this system of central banks, who created this system of having the reins of economic power outside of elected governments and therefore democratic accountability, so that they don't have to pay the consequence of their decision and we do. No, let's turn it on him. He has to use that power for us, and people should demand it.
Yes, and it is interesting, isn't it, that politicians have tended to sort of walk further away from taking responsibility rather than actually walking towards and dealing with the issues, because maybe it's more convenient for them to say it's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem, right? Oh, I blame the Reserve Bank. And as you say, Chalmers in his particular posturing around this is a great example. The other point I'd make, Robbie, is that the central banks and their ideology also flows through into corporate land as well. So you've actually got effectively very large corporations who play by a completely different set of rules to ordinary people. And it's those corporations who are more aligned actually to both the political powers and indeed also the central banks. So what you've got is a small number, but huge, powerfully place organizations over and against ordinary people. And that's why this whole thing is completely messed up, insofar that the bottom line is whatever levers they pull, who gets hit? Ordinary people get hit. Right, and because there's no, they said there's no other. Well, there are other options and opportunities. There are things that could be done, but the ideological positioning of central banks and large corporations means they won't be done, and that's why we can't allow the powers that do exist currently just to be dissipated and handed across to the central bank, and politicians wash their hands even more and say nothing to do with us.
No, exactly. And I just wanted to take up one of the questions asked by one of your listeners tonight. I think Lee Tran. He said, "Why should borrowers be looked after, but savers not be looked after?" Well, what we're calling for actually cuts both ways. We're saying right now the emergency is the fact that in order to deal with the inflation problem with only one tool, that Michelle Bullock lies. She only has one tool because it's not true. In order to deal with that inflation problem, they're crushing households now, and the crushing of households shows up in your figures. And the Treasurer has the power to overrule Michelle Bullock and say, no, you must lower I'm telling you, lower interest rates right now. He can do that right now. Equally, the Treasurer in the 2000s, so when interest rates started dropping to ridiculous levels, the Treasurer, Paul, I forget what they got to under Costello, but I know under Wayne Swan and then Joe Hockey, when interest rates really started getting to 1%, 0.5%, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
That Treasurer should have equally intervened, and long before it got to that,
spot on,
right?
Yep.
To say no, and he has the power to force the Reserve Bank to keep interest rates up. Right? That's what the power is not a one-sided thing. The power is important. It's so that the person who's thinking about what's good for the people, i.e. the government that we have some say over, actually has the final say in the way this is used, instead of washing their hands of it. And to be specific, what do we mean when we say Michelle Bullock's lying when she says she only has one tool? Because she said it in a Senate hearing.
Yep.
All the Reserve Bank has is interest rate. It's just not true. So in this bill that we want people to make submissions about before the 2nd of February, when submissions close, the RBA reform bill. We've talked about this before. So you've got this they did the RBA review in 2000 and they handed it down in 2023. And the number one recommendation out of its 50 recommendations is to repeal a power that's never been used. In 72 years, the Treasurer of the day has never overruled the Reserve Bank. In 72 years. Why was that the priority power? Well, anyway, we can say more about that, but just to stay on track here, that's the number one recommendation. The number two recommendation is to remove the power of the Reserve Bank to direct the lending policy of the private banks. And if you think about this, this gets really interesting because so here you have the power of the government to direct the Reserve Bank is going to be removed. And then the power of the government-owned Reserve Bank to direct the private banks is going to be removed. And this is where the rubber meets the road because that second power is another tool that the Reserve Bank has. And it's what I alluded to earlier. The Reserve Bank can look at the figures that we cited at the start of this conversation, where the growth in lending, lending is growing really fast at the moment, right? And the growth in lending is being led by lending to investors, investor loans. 1.9% growth in investor loans. There's only 0.5% growth in home loans. 0.5%. We have homeless people around Australia, right? There's a desperate housing shortage, but 0.5% growth in home loans, 1.9% growth in investor loans. And the Reserve Bank has the right, has the legislative power to look at those figures and go, all right, cut the crap. And call up Shane Elliott and Matt Common and the other two, whatever their names are, Peter King and the other one, call them up and say, stop lending to investors as of now. Just stop it. You're fueling the bubble. Stop it. Help people, help first home buyers, genuine first home buyers get in their home, etc. Provide relief for existing home buyers, but stop lending to investors. Stop lending to foreign investors. Just stop it. She has that power. And guess what? Our mates at Macro Business, Leith Van Onsen and Co., they showed about 6 weeks ago that fully half, Martin, of inflation, fully half of inflation in Australia at the moment is the housing market.
Yep.
Fully half of it. So if the Reserve Bank truly wants to address inflation, address the number one cause of inflation, which is the bank speculation in housing through investor loans. That's what they could do. And that woman said to a Senate hearing, falsely, I only have one tool, which is interest rates. It is a lie. Yet that tool is going to be legislated away in this bill. So why on it? Think about how insidious these goddamn banking elite are. They have decided, with everything going on, that they want to reform the Reserve Bank and get rid of those two powers, with everything going on. And the reason, I'll tell you why they've decided that. They've decided that because they're listening in on these conversations. In fact, I partly blame my wife, Elisa, because she wrote a submission. I kid you not, she wrote a submission to the Reserve Bank Review about those two sections, Section 11 and Section 36, and said, you should use them. And what comes out of the review? Get rid of them. Right? They are hearing the noises of the Australian public. They're hearing all manner of senators talk about this. Jared Rennick talked about it in Senate hearings. Malcolm Roberts, Nick McKim, the Green senator, talked about it. It's like they see the barbarians massing at the gate and they think, oh my God, they're going to actually, the people are going to take charge of the system. And the legacy of Curtin and Chifley is still in legislation. It's going to allow them to do it. Quick, get rid of those powers. Get rid of those. And a Labor treasurer is betraying Australian households and the legacy of his own party in order to accommodate it. That is insidious. It's treacherous. And that's why we're so fired up about it. And if you agree, make sure when you get off this conversation tonight, I'm talking to the viewers now, follow the link and make a submission to this Reserve Bank reform bill that the Senate Economics Legislation Committee is holding. demanding that they use these powers, not remove them.
Yeah, and just on those specific pieces of work that are going on in Parliament moments, right? It's worth just deviating slightly to talk about the regional banking inquiry, because this, for the first time, started to actually expose what real people were thinking about the banks and how they were behaving. And I would argue this is now an unstoppable train. Right now, we had the Royal Commission into banking, and there were some horrible case studies there that actually showed just how the banks were effectively exploiting their position over and against ordinary people. But unfortunately, at the end of that, nothing much changed. It was all sort of bit smoke and mirrors-ish. But this regional banking inquiry, and Robbie, you've actually been traveling around the regions and you've been sitting in listening to what the senators have been listening to, are really just highlighting how deep the pain is and how many people are actually really angry about what the banks have been doing. And I think a few people have said this is probably one of the most successful inquiries the Senate's ever been involved in.
Yeah, we've got a tiger by the tail, and it really hit a raw nerve, and I got a sense of that early on, and why it's one of the reasons we thought an inquiry would be so crucial, because it's the kind of pain people, the average person experiences on this issue is more like the death of 1,000 cuts, right? It's not as dramatic as a bank forcing you out of your home, right? Which is what the people, the bank victims who drove the establishment of the Banking Royal Commission, they suffered that, and there were tens of thousands of them, but that's all it was. And they were able to be. They thought they got the Royal Commission. They were happy for a year, and then it's gone nowhere. And there's a hardy band of them that are sticking with the fight, but most of them, they just run out of energy and they fall by the way. This is different, because the pain is, like I said, the death of 1,000 cuts. It's those aggravations from inconvenience that in the moment are infuriating, and then you go home and have a beer and you bellyache around the barbecue, and then you think, well, what can you do? Whatever. There's nothing you can do about it, and you grind your teeth. You might commit road rage on your way home because you've gone to a bank and it's closed, or you've been in a bank queue and you've given up for too long, or the bank wasn't there, right? Or the ATM's out of money, or the ATM's not there, and you miss an appointment, or you miss this opportunity, or whatever. Or you like the guy because it's flooded in Seymour again, just last week, but last year or the year before, when it flooded in Seymour, I probably told the story on the show, that the businessman who goes to ANZ took advantage of the flood in Seymour to shut the bank, because they had to. The bank got flooded, and so nothing was open for a day or so in Seymour. But then ANZ, callous bastards they are, thought, oh, here's a great opportunity, we just won't open again. So Seymour's an hour from Melbourne, and a businessman had to bank money. So he drives the hour to Melbourne, goes to Craigieburn, which is one of the the most northern suburbs here, closest to Seymour. And he goes in there, and they say, oh no, we don't take cash. We are a bank. We don't take cash. And they said, oh, you got to go to the Broadmeadows branch. And so he goes to the Broadmeadows branch, and they say, oh, we do take cash, but not on Tuesdays. And this guy who's got much better things to do, and he should have been doing it in 5 minutes at his Seymour branch of the ANZ. Imagine he was a roaring volcano at that moment in the Broadmeadows branch of the ANZ, right? And that story is repeated millions of times around Australia, and that's what we tapped into by getting this up. That's what we tapped into, and the towns where the whole town has had to put up without having a bank. And been left in the lurch. And read, if you haven't read them, just Google Cougar Petey and look at some of the news coverage in the last year on what poor old Cougar Petey's had to go through, right? When we've taken when the Senate committee took the hearings on the road and gave these towns the opportunity to testify, boy, did they testify, right? Did they turn up in droves? Did they tell their stories? And then the banks thought, they have a certain way of dealing with government. And so they started attending these hearings fairly confidently. And I can tell you, it didn't take long for the smile to be wiped off their bloody faces really fast. And suddenly they started getting quite intimidated, such that, remember last year, just a few months in to the inquiry, Westpac reversed its last 8 pending branch closures, just reversed them solely so it wouldn't have to go to an inquiry again. And in reversing, now think about what that means though. The assumption was these branches were unviable. That's why they were closing them. But in order not for their executives to have to go to a hearing, suddenly they're viable again. They're not. They're always viable. These banks have been shutting viable branches. And so our mate, friend of the show, Michael Sanderson, is one of these hardy band of bank victims that are still sticking with the fight. And they call themselves bank warriors and have these bow ties. If you want to see it, go to our show last week. We played the clip. They have these bow ties and they go and buy 1 or 2 shares in each of the banks so they can go to the AGM, because they go to the AGM and they get up at that microphone in the Q&A period and they ask their question. They go to the end of the queue and they come up again and they ask another question, and they stay on these bankers' case, and they go beyond just their own cases, and they're talking about other issues to do with banking. And Michael Sanderson contacted me and said, "Got any questions?" And you should see what he asked Westpac about Cuba Petey, which he called a mongrel act. He said, Cuba Petey, he said to Peter King and John McFarlane face, Cuba Petey, wasn't that a mongrel act, right? And you can see, Martin, in the body language of Peter King, and answer that question, he knows he didn't even try and reason with Michael in this question and answer period, because he knows that all the PR is against him. He basically played possum in that answer. Not even tried to look like he was defending the policy, except just say some token stuff. He tried to not engage on it. Whereas a year earlier, he'd been very effusive in defending the bank. The bank that seems to be the most still infuriating me out of touch is ANZ, because you've got this in their AGM in December, when they were asked about branch closures. The two IC and CEO Shane Elliott both said, "We love branches. It's our customers that don't love branches." And those two bastards lied through their teeth, because less than a month earlier, a whistleblower had come out from ANZ, a guy who actually quit his job over this because he was under orders from his superiors that when people come into the bank, don't serve them, make them go to the ATM so it doesn't count as a visit. Because if it doesn't count as a visit, we can turn around and say no one's visiting our branches and use that as an excuse to shut them down. He blew the whistle on the policy. It's the absolute truth. I was at the High Point Shopping Centre here in Melbourne before Christmas, and I saw a massive queue outside the Commonwealth Bank, and I took a photo of that. And then I walked past I wasn't looking for these. I was doing shopping, and I just walked past these. And I noticed inside the ANZ Bank there was also a queue, but it wasn't at the teller. It was at the ATM. There was nobody standing at the teller. The whole queue was at the ATM, exactly as this whistleblower had said was the policy. And those two liars stood on that AGM stage, Shane Elliott and his two IC. We love branches. And they're so arrogant and out of touch. But it's precisely that arrogance that's fueling this revolt against them. And it's the kind of thing that we've tapped into that and getting people to understand, well, hang on, we need to demand change here. And the change has to come in the form of people having a power over the banking system. And the best way that can happen is to bring back a people's bank, bring back a government bank that these institutions are forced to compete with. And actually, Martin, on that score, if we can go to that first image, because this was last Friday in the Courier Mail. Professor Paul Williams from Griffith University. This is just a mild example, but this is a random opinion column in the Courier Mail on Friday, where this Griffith University professor, "Can government owned come back into fashion?" In the first column there, he actually says, "Look, I was a how does he put it? He goes, I was a victim um, for the thousands of Australians burned by financial institutions. And I'm one of them. It feels like the 2018 Banking Royal Commission never even occurred, let alone mattered. And then he starts talking about the fact that once upon a time we did something different. And the second column there describes how the mixed economy of the 50s and 60s, where free enterprise was hemmed in by tight government controls, saw 2 decades of solid economic growth and also a narrowing of the gap between rich and poor. And despite my quoting Menzies before, there was Menzies who presided over that economy, because by the time Menzies came back the second time, there was this different consensus about how the economy should function, and it needed a government presence. And Menzies recognised that, and he knew he couldn't. He didn't try and change it. Today, Menzies, the Liberal Party would call Robert Menzies, a socialist in terms of the economy that he presided over. But we got to answer Cookie Boy's question before: what do we do without a property market? We got to 35% manufacturing in those days under that. So this guy, Paul Williams, is calling for, in the last column there, he goes, but surely one government-owned banking, insurance and telecommunications business would keep the rest of a privately owned, price-setting oligopoly responsive to community needs. Who knows, after 40 years of market liberalism, maybe government-owned will become the new economic black. And this is a theme that people are starting to get now, and it's thanks to the bastard behavior of the bank. If we get this, the bank's worst nightmare, it'll be their own fault. This punishment on them, Martin, will be self-inflicted because of this lying, arrogant bastardry displayed by these guys like the ANZ CEO, etc. But yeah, this has all come out of the process that we're able to get up an inquiry, and it's just taken on a life of its own.
And the point I want to underscore is that, because people often say to me, well, you keep describing the way the system is and it needs to change. Well, how do you get change? You get change by getting ordinary people, people watching this show and watching your show and elsewhere, to participate in the democratic process. And that's through making sure that you actually submit when there are inquiries, make sure that you actually attend when there are hearings. The power of the people is actually really, really strong. And the banks have now discovered that actually it's pretty terrifying when people really say what they think, and when the politicians suddenly realize that they can't just hide behind the bankers, because of course a lot of politicians automatically assume that you can't have a public bank and you've got to let the private sector reign supreme, which, by the way, is the Treasury position, unfortunately. But the truth is that this is beginning to change. But it takes, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and frankly, a lot of headbutting just to move this stuff forward. We've had some success over the years with, the cash question, and that's still continuing with the regional banking inquiry question, the questions that we're just highlighting now with regard to the role of the Reserve Bank versus the powers that the Treasurer has. And there are others too. But this is how democracy can actually drive towards a different direction. But it is the power of the people, and it means the people have got to step up. Yep.
And I think the thing we've learned is you've got to stay focused on it.
Yeah.
Right. So, our views have come from a lot of practical experience, a lot of original research, such as what's gone into this report, etc. But if you stay focused on these things, you can actually get a breakthrough, and in a way that affirms the proof of principle, right? Oh, okay, so this can actually work. And banking is so important because unless the people do push back, but in a focused way, and don't back away from pushing back, right? The banks expect people to just roll over and take it. And if you take the loss of cash, or if you take the abuses that led to the Banking Royal Commission, etc., if you just accept, it's like the campaign that John Adams is leading at the moment about ASIC, right? There's a side of human nature in Australians that they're not surprised to hear that ASIC is a corrupt regulator presiding over a corrupt system. But then the attitude is, well, what can you do about it? And that's what we've got to change, because that corrupt network likes nothing more than that attitude from Australians, right? And then you think, well, hang on, well, we're actually a pretty holier than thou country on the world stage. We go and lecture other countries the way they behave. Yet me, the average Australian, I just accept as a given that we have a corrupt regulator providing over a corrupt financial system, right? This actually should be unacceptable, and we should make sure that we do something about it. And that's what John Adams had ASIC by the scruff of the neck for the last a couple of years, which is really good, and that inquiry is ongoing, and it's about staying focused on it, because if we don't push back, they'll keep doing other things, and central bank digital currency will come along. And it would have come, if I'm convinced, Martin, if we hadn't fought the cash ban in 2019, we would have a central bank digital currency right now. We would have had pilot projects and all that kind of stuff, in the worst form of it, and people would have been told, oh, no, this is the way it's going to be. Now what we have is governments at least paying lip service to the idea that, oh no, we won't get rid of cash. Now, I believe them. I believe them that they mean it, that the governments won't get rid of cash, but they are definitely allowing the banks to take away access to cash. And so we have to fight that as well, and just keep pushing back and making them understand, well, no, we're not going to tolerate this. So it's the focus. It's keeping that focus, in seeing the fight through. That's what gets results.
Yeah, and it is seeing it through and continuing the fight. I think there's another interesting observation, Robbie, and that is that sometimes these things take much longer than they should. And if I can sort of segue slightly, because of course in the UK we've had a remarkable turn of events quite recently relating to the post office scandal. Now, people may not know about this in Australia, but years and years ago they actually put a new financial system in. Fujitsu was the company I used to work for, by the way. It was actually involved in doing it. So
I thought of you when I heard about this.
I had nothing to do with it. But the point was there that the system was actually faulty, and many hundreds of small independent post office entrepreneurs, the people who run the local post offices, suddenly found that their balances weren't balanced because of the system. And for years and years and years, the post office and the government and everybody else pretty much said, nothing to do with us. It's all to do with people in the post office, raiding the till. And some of them went to prison, and some of them actually committed suicide, because it was the whole system, the political system and the post office, which, by the way, in the UK is owned by the government, but as a standalone entity. And finally, after a piece of drama that was put out on television in the UK a couple of weeks ago, suddenly everyone's realized that actually injustices happened. And now everyone's sort of gone to the other side of the boat and said, oh, the post office did wrong. And, the CEO of the post office in the UK has handed back her CBE. And, now the point I'm trying to make is that the coalition of power around large corporates and around politicians means it's quite hard to move the needle sometimes. And I think this is a really important observation. This is not a simple battle that we're talking about here, but it's one we have to push. And in the case of the post office, finally now they're talking about some of those people being acquitted from what they were accused of previously. But it's a really terrible, terrible story, and it, to me, is a microcosm of the problem.
Yeah, and there's actually parallels to the way licensed post offices in Australia have been treated for years by Australia Post, and still are being treated, which is why we took up that case in the campaign to get an inquiry into Christine Holgate and get her reinstated. And we got the inquiry. Unfortunately, we didn't get her reinstated. And no, Drew Peacock, you can't get a gold watch. I keep seeing Drew Peacock asking for a gold watch. I'm not even sure they were gold, but they were Cartier they were Cartier watches, relatively cheap ones, in order to commemorate the work that led to the banks here, actually paying properly for the first time for being able to use post offices. And if you want to actually see how impressive these licensed post offices are, go find the footage of the 1st of December hearing in Canberra, because they testified at the bank closures inquiry just before Glenn Isherwood and I testified. And it was really impressive from Angela Cramp and Scott Etherington, the chairman, and that because they know how their post offices can serve the communities with banking, and they do it already, and they want to do it as a dedicated post office bank. So I'd heard about this UK scandal because the Christine Holgate campaign led to a greater understanding of post office issues, and it's just like it as you said, it shows you how corporate power is prepared to work. And the worst part of it is you still learn things about the arcane, anachronistic British system, Martin, because the post office had private prosecution powers.
Yep.
There is a system of private prosecutions, private criminal prosecutions in the UK, right? Private entities can bring prosecutions independent of the Department of Prosecutions. And that's what the post office did. And they were unwilling to admit that the system that they had forced the post office, the individual post office, to accept for accounting was flawed. They were unwilling to admit that. Now, at first, they assumed that they were right, and what this system had shown is a whole bunch of pilfering by the local post offices. That's what they assumed they'd found. But this went from 1999 until about 2015 or 2016. After a few years, they actually recognised the leaders of the post office, the management, they knew their system was flawed. Yet they doubled down to cover their ass, and they kept prosecuting these people, and they sent hundreds to jail. Hundreds of local post office, they call them sub postmasters, hundreds went to jail. Hundreds of them. And the drama starring that short British actor who played Dick Cheney in the George Bush movie, the W movie, if you remember that. I forget his surname. Anyway, the drama on ITV was called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. And it was a 4-part series, and they played it. And this has shocked the whole country. There's been people talking about the fact this could bring down the government, because between the government and the management of the post office, they not only did they ignore the problem that they knew about, they allowed these people to go to jail who were entirely innocent. So now that the scandal has erupted, the response is actually in the right direction. You got to admit that, right? So there's now there's a blanket clearance exoneration of the people who were convicted. They stand to get compensation. Minimum, if you went to jail, minimum of £600,000. More under special circumstances, etc. So that's the second round of that's what they were forced to raise it to. The first compensation offered was £75,000 to people who had had their whole lives ruined and sent to jail who were innocent. They wanted to get away with offering them £75,000. Now it's £600,000. So it's moving in the right direction. But Martin, I've got to play the second thing that we had that we planned here, because I found this on Twitter. And to me, it epitomizes. This was an interview on British television about this scandal, and I don't know whether to. I'll just play the interview, and then I'll reveal the punchline later. But can you see my screen? Okay.
I've got your screen, but you've got the wrong slide up at the moment.
Oh, hang on. Let me get that one off. Just bear with me.
Okay.
Sorry about this, viewers. Technical difficulties. Hang on.
It's all right. It played before, so it should play again.
Is it visible?
No.
Well, maybe I'll do all right, I'll try this. What about now?
Yep, it is now.
Okay. All right. Sorry, viewers. So hopefully you can see this. This is my Twitter feed. All right. So um, I'll just play you this little clip because to me, this actually captures a truth, a universal truth about politics.
How come the government didn't notice? You were asleep on duty, weren't you?
No, Susanna, I don't think that's fair. I mean, you have to understand that before this week, not one drama starring Toby Jones had been made on this subject, not one. And that to me shows a lack of duty of care. You know, Toby Jones is a very fine actor, but what was he doing? You know, I understand The Detectorists was very good, but who was that helping? And what I want to know is why it took so long for ITV to make this drama. There's been many miscarriages of justice. I was on Twitter this morning and someone was tweeting about ex-commandos in Afghanistan and how they've been abandoned by the British government. And what I say to them is, you know, the government can't do anything, can't do everything. And everything, you know, can't do everything. But we can watch dramas, you know, and we will watch dramas. You know, if they're especially if they're starring Toby Jones.
Oh, very good, very good.
Oh dear. Now that's a comedian. She's spliced herself into an actual morning show interview. But there's a truth to that. Like the way these politicians think, if it's they don't have to do anything about it unless it's in the media. And in the case of this particular scandal, they got this. It's all erupted on the back of this impressive drama starring Toby Jones. That's actually, and I know there's a truth to that because it's helped with the bank closures inquiry. Because actually, this is something that media and local media do cover, and that's what's kept it's one of the big reasons the politicians have stayed engaged in it. But yeah, it's a sad.
Oh dear, Robbie has frozen. So I'm not sure whether he will be able to come back or whether that is it. Interestingly, let me just go on to that. So there you go. Robbie at the moment has disappeared and he may well be able to reload himself. He may not. We'll see in a second. But we've come to pretty much the end of the show anyway. And the point, of course, with all of this is that there are many, many streams of activity currently underway which potentially have a significant impact. So the inquiry is still looking at regional branch closures. And in fact, there is still opportunity to make a submission. So go check that. The inquiry relating to the role of the central bank and the Treasury, that's still open at the moment. And again, you can make a submission there. And the story over the next few months will be quite a lot of focus specifically on the question of making sure that we can move this dial forward. You know, the role of the banks, the role of the financial system, and the fact that the bottom line is always somehow that the ordinary people are the ones who get hit at the bottom, whilst you know, the banks get bailed out. And I just want to highlight the bailout there of the banks. Thank you very much for the super chat. I really appreciate it. So the banks got bailed out through the global financial crisis. The term funding facility was effectively money that was paid by the RBA to the banks ultimately. That money is now, of course, due to be repaid. And thank you, Jason, for the super chat too. Appreciate that. That money is being repaid now, and that means that the banks are now looking to increase the costs of funding, which means they're going to be less able to pass their interest rates down when rate cuts come, as they will later in the year. And the bottom line, of course, always is that the activity that we take as individuals and as communities, and as we try and actually fire the line of momentum towards the politicians, is around making sure that the banks are able to be brought back under control a little more. And, the idea of having a bank that is ultimately not just for the private interests and the private returns of international investors, but also a bank that lends more to those who are actually building businesses and investing in infrastructure in Australia is a critical capability. And that's one of the reasons why I think the idea of a national bank is pretty critical. And, the infrastructure is already there through the post office system. Robbie's just clicked to come back in. Hang on a moment. Let's see if I can bring him back in. Robbie, hello. Robbie's just popped back in. I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. We had a little bit of a hiatus. You're on the phone now, obviously.
Yeah, the power just completely failed. We're in a new house. Don't know how it works. Everything just went very dark. And then it's taken the internet a while to boot back up again. So I thought I'd better get on my phone.
Well, I appreciate that. And I was just rounding off the show, Robbie, to highlight the fact that there are still some of these inquiries open.
Yes.
So we've got a few days on the one relating to the role of the Reserve Bank versus the Treasury, right?
Well, the first one that people might be interested in is the digital ID legislation. And submissions to that close on the 19th. So that's at the end of this week. And I think it is anyone who has any burning concerns in this area should absolutely make a submission. So you just go on the it's on the, I think it's also on the Economics Committee website. It's on the digital ID bill. And one of the points, there's lots of things that you can say about the proposal for a digital ID. I mean, there is a certain element of technology will increasingly move in this direction, but it's when governments choose to make these things mandatory, force them on people, which the government is saying that they're not going to do. Right, it'll be entirely voluntary, but we've heard that before, and what they do without passing a law that says you must have a digital ID, they will start making access to services dependent on a digital ID, right? And so that goes to the way governments operate. It is something that there should always be people who express the concern that, hang on, are the civil liberties of these implications of these things, being considered. But it also goes to the fact that the government has a digital agenda, and it's the same as the banks, frankly, which is partly them also shirking their responsibilities. They're looking to do more and more digitally, right, instead of actually providing a service. And I know this first was made obvious to me in the Cloncurry hearing of the bank branch closures inquiry, because the Cloncurry Council made the point that what the banks are doing is nothing new because the governments have already been doing it, like shutting down Centrelink's and consolidating those and making those harder to access, things like that, right? And then once the Cloncurry Council made that observation, the banks themselves have used it as an excuse. I heard Anna Bligh, the head of the Banking Association, use it as an excuse. Well, governments are shutting down services and making people use digital. Why can't we, right? And so we, the public, should think about that and go, well, at the end of the day, what's important about the provision of service is actually you provide a service. And we are not in a position yet, despite what any loopy bank executive or politician thinks, to be exclusively digital economy. We're just not there. It is not reliable, right? And so even from that standpoint alone, there's real strong reasons to push back on the digital ID bill and the untrustworthiness of the government that's pushing it. So that's we've got 3 days to make that point. Get on the Senate page and have a look at that. The big one, in our view, which we spent most of tonight's show talking about, is the Reserve Bank Reforms Bill. Submissions on that are open until the 2nd of February. And I really think this is something that everybody should weigh in on. And so I'll credit our party's national chairperson, Anne Lawler, with making the point that these powers should be used, not removed. And like I said, it's not as simple as saying, oh, the government should just make sure they drop interest rates. At the moment, I really think they should, to provide relief, but with the use the other powers to make sure that doesn't fuel more investor speculation. They can actually stop lending to investors. But it's also a power the government should use in the other direction when necessary. Like, they should never have allowed interest rates to fall to the ridiculous levels they fell to, right? They should have always been kept around 4 to 5%, and look for there is other ways to address inflation questions in the economy. So anyway, it's about that. It's about democratic accountability and the central bank agenda we've talked about, and they're determined to get rid of all that. So whatever angle that you in a sense are most connected to, express it. Oppose in the strongest terms this bill. And I think we have a chance, Martin, to stop the bill going through, because just before Christmas, Jim Chalmers was complaining about the fact that he thought he had a deal with Angus Taylor, that this bill was supposed to be waved through. And instead, Angus Taylor supported it going to an inquiry. That's as a result already of the complaints coming from the public, which we've generated. Right, so let's flood this inquiry with objections to this bill, and by the 2nd of February. And the other thing that people can act on is on this broader question of bank branches, the cash issue. You and I spoke before Christmas about Michelle Bullock actually airing the idea there could be a surcharge put on cash transactions, just so she can put her thumb on the scale and tip it in favor of the banks over the consumer and over the small business people. Absolutely disgusting idea. But these broader, the system, the central bank, the private banks pushing back against our campaign, which is actually getting the politicians organised. That larger inquiry is going through to at least May. There'll be another round of hearings in South Australia and Western Australia in the coming months. But it's open for submissions again, a second round of submissions, and those submissions are open until the 29th of February. And so if you've got something to say on the cash issue, want to relate an example of something that's happened to you or a certain insight, etc., please make a submission. Encourage other people to make submissions to that inquiry, because this is one inquiry where I can assure you the politicians, the senators, are paying attention thanks to the success of the inquiry.
Yeah, Robbie. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming back on with the phone powered. It's held up very well. Glad we got to the end of the show, and to underscore again, the whole point about this show was to say two things. One is central banks are not necessarily aligned to your own interests, right? Central banks have their own agenda, firstly. But secondly, the power of the people, the ability to be able to actually make sure that our views are being heard, are very powerful too. And so there is a really significant opportunity to shape some of the future by getting submissions in and making sure that our politicians hear that we're not just prepared to roll over and be steamrolled by a central bank digital currency, or central banks taking even greater control, the unelected, the undemocratic, right? There is an alternative, and that alternative is real and valid and viable. And that's what we want to try and steer the future towards, because it's really important we do that, because if we don't do that, then people are going to get more and more under the thumb of those international technocrats who really have no interest in individuals and their futures. It's all about their own plans and their own agendas, which aren't necessarily well aligned.
No, exactly, Martin. So anyway, sorry about the technical difficulties, people. We could talk for a lot longer if we had better infrastructure, but hey, this is the real world. And unlike doing a transaction where I can just pull out a wad of cash, hey, can I say, I got to relate this. There's been 2 times in the last few weeks where because I've had cash, was able to do the quicker, more convenient transaction than the poor mug in front of me who had a car, who was trying to use his phone on the system to wave his phone around. One, because the local fuel station system went down, and they said, "Oh, you got to wait for 10 minutes before it comes back." And I said, "I'm in a hurry. I got cash. Can I just give you the cash?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, I suppose." And this poor old tradie had to stand at the side because all he had was a phone. And then at another store, they were just having he was finding it difficult to make his phone work, and he was trying. And I was buying a $5 item, and I had a $5 note, and bang bang, and I was the quick and convenient one. So anyway, look, this technical difficulty just illustrates the reality that this stuff is not 100% reliable. So just from a practical standpoint, let's not get rid of the tried and true method of transacting in cash and force these damn idiot politicians to see that.
Yeah, hold some cash in case you need it. And actually, sometimes you get better prices if you're paying cash.
You do. I'm getting discounts left, right, and centre.
Yeah. So there you go. Robbie, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for bearing with us, folks. Okay. But I think it was a really important session. And we'll have you back on in the next few weeks and continue this story, because this is a really important agenda for 2024. I'm going to take you off stream now, and I'm going to close the show. Thanks, Robbie. See you later. Cheers.
See you, man. Bye.
There you go, folks. Well, I'm glad that Rob was able to get back in and finish the show there. Just to tell you that next week we're going to have a conversation about property, and so we'll get one of our property experts to come on as well. And that should be a fun show, because there's a lot to talk about there with regard to what's happening and trying to unpick what's going along with the various dimensions around property. So Veronica Morgan's coming on, and we'll be able to explore some of that with her. And then I've got Leith Van Onselen coming on, I think, the week after. And so we go on. Well, thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday with us. Hope you found that interesting, informative, and hopefully a bit challenging too, in terms of thinking that there are things we can do. That's the whole idea. Just before I go, show you the dogs are still in their place, looking particularly comfortable at the moment. They got up and wandered around at one point. You may have heard them scrabbling around, but they're now sort of working towards lunch. So that'll be the next thing today. I want to say thank you very much for all those super chat contributions. Really appreciated those. And it helps just to sort of cover what we do here. And please share, like, and spread the word about this show. And I look forward to seeing you next week on the next live show, or of course other recorded shows over the next few days. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. See you later. Bye.